The air was thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and mud, the scent of commerce mixed with cruelty. Beneath the wooden beams of a small southern auction house, a young woman stood trembling, her wrists bound by a coarse rope that bit into her skin. The crowd before her laughed and jeered, men chewing on bitter leaves while their eyes weighed her like livestock. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She only watched the dust rising from their boots and silently prayed that the next name called wouldn't be hers. When the hammer fell, the echo cracked through her bones. 20 cents. Her name was Sarah, at least. That's what she remembered being called once, back before her tongue forgot what it felt like to answer freely. She was young, no more than 19, though her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone twice that age. And deep within her body, she carried another life, a child conceived not out of love, but through violation. The man who had owned her before, a plantation lord named William Hayes, had forced himself upon her in the dark of his house while his wife slept 2 doors away. That child now grew quietly inside her, as the world outside decided what her worth would be. The new master was Samuel Carter, a man whose reputation was as rough as the land he farmed. He was not rich. He did not wear the fine clothes of the big plantation owners, but he knew a bargain when he saw one. 20 cents, he muttered as he led her away, his boots sinking into the mud. You better be worth it. Sarah didn't answer. Her bare feet followed his steps in silence, the rope still around her wrists. Each tug forward felt like a sentence being written by someone else's hand, her future already decided. That night, the journey to Carter's farm seemed endless. The moonlight flickered through the branches as if ashamed to watch. The wagon creaked with every turn, its wheels screaming in protest over the uneven dirt road. Sarah sat at the back, her head lowered, her thoughts drifting to the small house she had once worked in, the Hayes estate. She could still remember the scent of magnolia flowers that grew outside the kitchen window, the soft hum of the housemaid humming spirituals at dawn. Those moments had felt safe, almost human, until the night everything changed. She had been folding laundry in the corner when Hayes walked in, drunk and staggering. His words slurred. His hands didn't ask permission. And when it was over, she lay there in silence, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, waiting for the sound of footsteps to fade away. No one came. No one ever would. Weeks later, when her stomach began to swell, Mrs. Hayes noticed, and the punishment was immediate. Sarah was beaten, then sold. The mistress couldn't bear to see a reminder of her husband's sin in her house. And so Sarah was dragged to the auction block, her body bruised, her soul fractured, and sold for 20 cents. The Carter farm was a lonely place, miles away from the nearest town. The fields were dry, the fences broken. The master lived alone, except for an old mare and a silent servant who never looked anyone in the eye. Samuel Carter wasn't a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He didn't whip for pleasure or shout to assert dominance. But his indifference was colder than hate. To him, Sarah was simply another tool, another set of hands to mend his failing land. On her first morning, she woke before sunrise to the sound of rain tapping on the tin roof. Her back ached from sleeping on the floor beside the hearth. She pushed herself up, pressing one hand to her stomach, and began her work, hauling water, mending nets, scrubbing floors that would never truly be clean. Every motion felt heavier now. Her child shifted within her, reminding her with every small flutter that she was not alone. Even in this emptiness, sometimes in the quiet hours, she would hum softly, a tune she had learned from her mother before they were separated years ago. It was a song of the river, slow, mournful, but carrying a promise of freedom somewhere beyond the horizon. It was the only thing that still belonged to her. Days blurred into weeks. The fields turned golden, then brown. Carter's moods changed with the weather, silent one day, drunk the next. Once, when she spilled a pail of milk, he slapped her, just once. The sound echoed like thunder, but the shame that followed was worse than the pain. "I paid for you," he said simply. "Don't forget that." At night, Sarah would lie awake and think about her child. Would it be born into chains too? Would it ever see a sunrise without fear? She didn't know. But she had made a quiet promise to herself. If there was any chance, any breath of freedom, she would take it. For the child's sake. Sometimes she dreamed of the old stories told by the elders in the quarters. Stories of a land across the river where people could walk without being owned. A place where names meant something again. Freedom wasn't real here, but it lived inside her dreams. As months passed, her belly grew. The other workers, when they came to trade or borrow, whispered about her. The girl who'd been bought for a coin. Some pitied her. Some envied the small kindness Carter sometimes showed. An extra slice of bread, a warm coat during winter. But none of them knew the truth. Every kindness from a master came with an invisible chain. Every word of pity reminded her she was still property. One cold evening, she sat by the fire, rubbing her swollen belly, when Carter returned from town. He smelled of whiskey and smoke. He watched her for a long moment before saying, "That baby ain't mine." She didn't answer. She didn't look up. He took a slow step closer. "Who was it?" When she still didn't speak, he laughed, a dry, cruel laugh. "Don't matter. Ain't my problem what your old master did to you. But when that child comes, you better be ready to work double. You hear me?" She nodded. "Yes, master," that word tasted like poison. Winter came hard that year. Frost crept into the windows like ghostly fingers. Sarah's hands cracked from cold water and endless labor. Each breath stung her lungs. Still she worked, because stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant punishment. Stopping meant death. But inside her, the child kicked stronger each day. Sometimes she would stop and place her hand gently over her belly, whispering, "You gonna see a better world, baby. You hear me? Mama's gonna find a way." It was a whisper meant for God, though she wasn't sure he was listening anymore. Then came the night of the storm. The wind howled across the fields, tearing through the wooden fences like paper. Rain lashed against the windows. Carter stumbled through the door, half drunk, cursing the weather. Sarah sat near the hearth, stitching an old blanket. Lightning split the sky, lighting up the room for an instant. And in that flash, Carter saw her face. Calm, silent, defiant in a way that unsettled him. "What you looking at?" he barked. "Nothing, sir." He took a step closer, eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me." She lowered her gaze, clutching the fabric in her lap. But he kept coming closer, the smell of alcohol thick in the air. His hand gripped her chin, forcing her to look up. For a moment the world was silent except for the storm outside. And in that silence, something inside Sarah broke. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the drink. But Carter stopped. He stared at her, at the tears in her eyes, the fear, the exhaustion. And something like shame flickered across his face. He released her and stepped back, muttering curses to himself before stumbling out into the rain again. That night, Sarah cried for the first time in months, not from fear, but from relief, because for once, the monster had turned away. By spring, the world had changed again. The war was whispering through the land now. Words of rebellion, of freedom, of men fighting for something more than fields and gold. Rumors reached even the Carter farm. Slaves whispered about a man named Lincoln, about papers that might make them free. Hope, that dangerous, fragile thing, began to stir again. Sarah listened quietly, never daring to believe too much. But every whisper felt like sunlight breaking through cracks in her prison. Her baby came one gray morning in early April. The labor was long and cruel. Alone in the small cabin, she clutched the edge of the bed and screamed until her voice gave out. The rain fell again that day, softer this time, as if washing the world clean. And when it was over, she held a tiny boy in her arms, his skin lighter than hers, his cry small but fierce. She named him Isaiah, after the prophet who spoke of deliverance. When Carter saw the child, he said nothing. He only nodded and left the room. Sarah didn't care. The moment she looked into her baby's eyes, the world outside no longer mattered. For the first time, she felt something close to freedom. Not because she was free, but because love had found her, even in chains. Days became weeks. Isaiah grew strong. Sarah carried him on her back as she worked the fields, humming the same river song she once sang as a child. The other workers smiled when they heard her, a small sound of life in a world built on death. But freedom, like every dream, comes with a price. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at the Carter farm. A man in a gray coat, riding a tired horse. He carried papers and spoke in low tones with the master. Sarah couldn't hear their words, but she saw the look on Carter's face, a look of anger, then fear. Later that night, Carter told her, "There's talk the law's changing. They say folks like you might be freed soon. But don't you go thinking that means you can just walk away. You still belong here. Understand?" She nodded, but deep inside, something had shifted. She no longer believed him. That night, as the moon rose high above the fields, Sarah stood by the window holding Isaiah. The air was warm, and the world was quiet except for the distant croak of frogs and the rustle of trees. She looked toward the north, the direction the elders always said led to freedom. Somewhere beyond those hills, men were fighting to end this life of chains. Somewhere beyond those hills, there was a place where her son could have a name that wasn't written in someone else's ledger. She whispered to the sleeping child, "We goin' soon, baby. Mama's gonna find that river." The river, that endless symbol of escape, of rebirth, of hope. She didn't know when. She didn't know how, but she knew this. The world was changing, and she would not let it pass her by. Outside, a soft wind blew across the fields, carrying with it the scent of spring and distant gunfire. The storm that once frightened her was no longer something to fear. It was a sign that freedom, fragile, flickering but alive, was coming. The nights had grown restless. Sarah no longer slept through them. She watched. She listened. Every sound in the dark felt like a whisper from fate, urging her toward something she could not yet name. The war that had begun as rumor was now thunder. Men were marching, bleeding, dying for words she could barely believe in: freedom, union, equality. But to her, those words were still far away, echoes from another world. At the Carter farm, life went on as if time itself had stopped. The fields needed tending, the fences mending. Samuel Carter rarely spoke of the fighting except to curse it. "Fools," he would growl at the radio chatter in town. "Ain't nothing good ever come from letting slaves think they people." He didn't see the look that passed through Sarah's eyes when he said that. He didn't notice how she held Isaiah a little closer each time. Isaiah was learning to walk now. His laughter filled the small cabin with a warmth that even winter couldn't touch. He was light-skinned, with eyes that reflected both his mother's softness and the shadow of the man who had forced him into existence. But to Sarah he was only light, proof that something pure could still be born from darkness. One afternoon, as the sun hung low over the fields, a sound cut through the still air, the rhythmic clop of hooves. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, dust swirling behind them. Sarah froze, her hands tightening around the bucket she was carrying. The last time strangers had come, people had disappeared. Carter stepped out to meet them. They spoke in hurried tones. The men wore gray uniforms, Confederate soldiers. Their leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, handed Carter a folded paper. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she saw the color drain from the master's face. When the men rode away, Carter stood there for a long while, staring after them like a man who had just seen his own grave. That night, he sat by the fire, whiskey in hand, muttering to himself, "They're taking everything. Every damn thing." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes heavy. "They say the Union Army's moving closer. If they come through here, they'll burn it all. Houses, farms, everything." He paused, then added bitterly, "They say they'll free you too. But don't you believe it. You ain't got nowhere to go." Sarah said nothing, but her heart began to beat faster. Somewhere out there, soldiers were fighting to break the chains. And maybe, just maybe, she could find them. A week later, a man came to the farm at night. His name was Jonah, a runaway from a nearby plantation. He had been hiding in the woods for weeks, living off roots and river water. When he stumbled upon Carter's field, he was weak, starving, half-mad with exhaustion. Sarah found him behind the barn, barely conscious. She brought him water, hid him beneath hay, and whispered for him to stay quiet. "Union soldiers," he croaked. "They comin' from the north. I seen them. Couple days, maybe." His eyes, though fevered, burned with something fierce, hope. She gave him food, risked punishment to keep him alive. Each night she would slip away to the barn, Isaiah asleep in a basket nearby, and listen to Jonah's stories. He spoke of camps where black men fought alongside white men, of preachers turned soldiers, of a proclamation from President Lincoln himself. words on paper that declared freedom for the enslaved. When Jonah said the words Emancipation Proclamation, Sarah whispered them back softly, like a prayer. Emancipation. The syllables tasted strange, powerful, like the first breath after being held underwater. But not all secrets stay hidden. One morning, as Sarah carried feed to the barn, she saw Carter standing by the door, rifle in hand. His face was stone. Jonah was on the ground, his hands tied. Blood stained the hay. You think I'm a fool? Carter hissed. Harboring a runaway? You could have brought soldiers to my land. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice failed. Carter raised the rifle, pointing it at Jonah. The man didn't beg. He only looked at Sarah and whispered, "Run." The gunshot shattered the silence. Isaiah, startled from his nap inside the cabin, began to cry. Sarah fell to her knees, the world spinning. Jonah's body lay still, eyes open, staring toward the north, the direction of freedom. Carter spat on the ground. You remember what happens to people who forget where they belong. He turned and walked away. That night, Sarah buried Jonah beneath the old oak tree behind the barn. She used her bare hands, digging through the cold earth until her fingers bled. She didn't cry. She couldn't, but when the wind rustled through the branches, she thought she heard his voice again. Run. The next morning, she made her choice. While Carter was gone to town, she packed what little she had, a piece of bread, a blanket, and a small silver locket she had once found in the dirt behind the house. She wrapped Isaiah in the blanket and whispered, "We going to find the river, baby. We going to find the light." She knew the risk. She knew the punishment if caught. But death was no worse than the life she was leaving behind. As dusk fell, she slipped through the back gate and into the woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of night, crickets, owls, the distant growl of thunder. The ground was soft beneath her feet, the air damp with spring rain. She moved quickly but carefully, clutching Isaiah close. Every shadow looked like danger. Every crack of a branch sounded like a gun being cocked. She followed the stars north, remembering what Jonah had told her. Follow the drinking gourd. The constellation, shaped like a ladle, pointed the way to freedom. It was said to guide those who sought the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses that helped fugitives reach the free states. Hours turned into days. Her legs ached. Her stomach gnawed with hunger. Once she thought she heard dogs in the distance and hid beneath a fallen tree until the sound faded. Rain soaked her clothes, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. For every mile she walked, she whispered Isaiah's name like a spell to keep them both alive. On the third night, she reached the river. It was wider than she remembered from Jonah's stories, dark and violent beneath the moonlight. She stood at its edge, trembling. The other side looked impossibly far. She wrapped Isaiah tighter and stepped into the water. It was freezing, a shock that stole her breath. Each step sank her deeper, the current pulling hard against her legs. The baby whimpered, his cries lost in the roar of the river. "Hold on, baby," she gasped. "Mama's right here." Halfway across, the current caught her skirt and dragged her down. She fought, clawing at the water, one arm around her child. Her lungs burned. Her muscles screamed. For a moment, she thought she saw faces in the water, the ghosts of all those who had tried before her. They didn't look angry. They looked like they were guiding her. With a final desperate surge, she found footing, a shallow stretch where the current eased. She stumbled forward, coughing, soaked to the bone. When she reached the far bank, she collapsed onto the mud, clutching Isaiah to her chest. The baby was crying to life. She laughed through tears, pressing her forehead to his. "We made it, baby. We made it." But the night wasn't over. From across the river came the faint sound of voices, men shouting, dogs barking. Carter had discovered her escape. Panic surged through her veins. She gathered her strength and began to run, the forest swallowing her whole. Branches tore at her skin. Thorns ripped her dress, but she didn't stop. She could hear the dogs now, closer, their barks echoing like gunfire through the trees. Somewhere ahead, she saw light, a small cabin hidden beneath a canopy of vines. She stumbled toward it, pounding on the door. It opened just enough for a face to appear, an older woman with eyes that seemed to see straight through the dark. "Please," Sarah gasped. "Please, they come in." The woman didn't ask questions. She pulled them inside, bolting the door. "You safe here, child," she whispered. "You found the right place." Sarah collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Isaiah cried softly against her shoulder. The woman knelt beside her and placed a hand on her cheek. "My name's Miss Clara," she said, "and you ain't property no more." Outside, the dogs barked in frustration. Then, slowly, the sound faded into the night. For the next few days, Sarah and Isaiah stayed hidden with Miss Clara and her husband, a preacher named Elias. They were part of the Underground Railroad, ordinary people risking their lives to help fugitives reach safety. Elias drew maps in the dirt, showing the route north, through the marshes, then the hills, until they reached Union lines. "Once you cross there," he said, "ain't no one can claim you again." Each night, Sarah listened to the news of the war. Battles fought, towns burned, soldiers captured. Freedom was coming, but slowly, painfully. Every victory was paid for in blood. When it was time to move again, Miss Clara gave her food, clothes, and a small wooden cross. "Keep this close," she said. "And remember, the Lord don't always move fast, but he moves sure." Sarah nodded. She didn't know if she still believed, but she held the cross anyway. The journey north was harder than she imagined. Hunger gnawed at her. Rain soaked her bones. Once she stumbled upon a patrol of Confederate scouts and had to hide beneath a fallen log for hours, Isaiah muffled against her chest. When they finally passed, she wept silently, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Days later, she reached a burned-out village. Smoke still rose from the ruins. In the distance, she saw soldiers, bluecoats this time, not gray, Union. She almost couldn't believe it. A young soldier spotted her and raised his rifle, but when he saw the baby in her arms, his expression softened. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you're safe now." The words felt unreal. Safe. She sank to her knees, clutching Isaiah, and for the first time, she allowed herself to cry, deep, shaking sobs that had waited too long to be freed. They brought her to a camp just beyond the river, filled with others like her, men, women, and children who had run through fire for the promise of liberty. Some were wounded, others starving, but all of them carried the same light in their eyes, the light of the unbroken. An officer came to her tent that evening. "Name?" he asked, pen poised. "Sarah," she said. Then, after a pause, "Sarah Carter." She wasn't his property anymore, but she took his name as a mark of defiance, proof that she had survived him. When the officer handed her a paper marked with the Union seal, her hands trembled. It was a pass, her proof of freedom. She looked down at Isaiah, asleep beside her, and whispered, "You free now, baby. You born in chains, but you gonna grow in the light." Outside, the soldiers sang softly by the fire, a song of home, of peace, of a nation trying to rebuild itself. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the flames and the weight of the journey behind her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The war had ended. At least, that's what the soldiers said. The world was supposed to be changing now. There were speeches in towns, papers nailed to church doors, songs sung in the streets, songs of freedom, of new beginnings. But for Sarah, freedom did not come with fireworks or celebration. It came with silence, the deep, aching kind that follows after thunder. She stood on a hill outside the Union camp, Isaiah cradled against her hip, watching the smoke rise from the fields below. The land that had once been her prison was now scarred with battle, fences torn down, barns burned, the bones of war scattered through the mud. The world she had escaped was dying. And yet, in its death, a new question haunted her. Where does someone like me go now? Freedom had no map. The papers they gave her said she was no longer property. But paper couldn't build a home. Paper couldn't feed a child. And paper couldn't erase the memories that lived behind her eyes. The refugee camp swelled each day with new faces. People who had run from their masters. People who had been found. People who had lost everything except the will to breathe. Union soldiers called them freedmen, but most still felt like ghosts, hovering between the old world and the new. Sarah found work washing clothes for the officers. The pay was barely enough to buy bread, but it was something. At night, she sat by the fire with other women, Mary, Ruth, old Mama Joe, and listened as they told stories of the lives they had left behind. Some spoke of children sold away, some of husbands taken by war, and when they asked her story, she said only, "I ran." That was enough. They understood Isaiah was growing fast, sturdy legs, wide, curious eyes. The soldiers doted on him, calling him Little Freedom Boy. He would toddle around the camp, chasing chickens and laughing, his joy cutting through the weariness that hung over them all. Sometimes Sarah would just watch him and think, he doesn't know. He doesn't know what the world once was. In the spring of 1866, the army began disbanding the camps. The war was over. The freed had to find their place in this new America. Some left for the cities, others returned south to reclaim land that was once theirs. Sarah decided to follow a group heading toward Nashville, where they said there were schools for freedmen and jobs for those who could work. It was a long walk. She carried Isaiah most of the way, his little head resting against her shoulder. Along the roads they passed burned plantations, broken wagons, fields where nothing grew. The air still smelled of ash and sorrow. But the farther north they went, the more the world began to look alive again. Small towns rising from ruins, churches opening their doors, preachers shouting words of renewal and grace. When they finally reached the outskirts of Nashville, Sarah stopped and stared. The city was loud, crowded, and pulsing with energy. Soldiers, merchants, newly freed men and women, all trying to find their footing. It was chaos, but it was also possibility. For the first time in her life, she could walk down a street without looking over her shoulder. She found a small room in a boarding house run by a widow named Miss Eleanor, who had lost her husband in the war, but believed fiercely in the new Union cause. "You got a good heart, child," she told Sarah. "You work hard. You'll make it here." Sarah wanted to believe that. She took a job cleaning at the Franklin Hotel, a place where travelers and merchants came to drink, argue, and talk about the changing South. Most of them still looked at her the way men had always looked at women like her, as if she were invisible until she wasn't. But she kept her head down, her words few, and her mind focused on survival. Each evening, she would return home and teach Isaiah the few letters she'd learned from the Union nurses. A, B, C. The boy's small fingers traced the shapes in the dirt, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Say it, baby," she'd whisper. B, C, he'd repeat, smiling. "Good, that's the start of your freedom right there." Sometimes, when the nights grew long and the wind whispered through the cracks of the old boarding house, she would take out the silver locket, the one she'd carried all the way from Carter's farm. Inside was nothing, just a blank space where a picture should have been. But to her it held everything, the weight of her past, the proof that she had survived it. 2 years passed. The world changed again, slowly, unevenly. The newspapers spoke of new laws, new rights. Black men could vote now, at least in theory. But the streets told a different story. Old hatred didn't die. It just put on new clothes. One night after work, she walked home through the narrow alley behind the hotel and heard 2 men talking. Their voices were low, urgent. She caught only fragments. The new order. Keep 'em in line. White brotherhood. When one of them stepped into the lamplight, she saw the folded cloth in his hand, white, with crude eye holes cut through it. She hurried away before they saw her, her heart pounding. A new fear had taken shape in this free world, one that didn't need chains or whips, just hatred and fire. Freedom, she realized, was not the end of the road. It was the beginning of another battle. By 1870, Isaiah was 5. He could already read simple words and count on his fingers. Sarah saved every penny she could, dreaming of sending him to one of the new freedmen's schools. "You're going to be somebody," she'd tell him. Not just free, somebody. But the world around them made that dream fragile. Every day brought news of raids, of lynchings, of black churches burned in the night. Sometimes she wondered if the river she'd crossed had truly carried her to freedom, or just to another kind of struggle. Then, one evening, a familiar face appeared at the boarding house door. It was Elias, the old preacher from the Underground Railroad. His beard was grayer now, his body thinner, but his eyes still burned with faith. "The Lord done brought you far, child," he said when she opened the door. "I've been traveling, spreading word. We building a community down by the Cumberland. Land for folks like us. You and your boy could come. The offer lit something inside her. A home, land, a place where her son could run without fear. She packed what little they owned and followed Elias out of the city. The settlement was small but alive, families building cabins, men clearing fields, women tending gardens and teaching the children. They called it New Dawn. To Sarah, it felt like the first real place she could breathe. There was laughter here. There were Sunday songs, the smell of cornbread baking, and children's voices echoing through the trees. She planted vegetables, sewed clothes, and on Sundays she stood with the others at the small wooden church Elias built with his hands. When he preached, the words filled the air like music. God didn't free us just to survive. He freed us to rise. At night she would sit by the fire, Isaiah asleep beside her, and watch the stars. Sometimes she would trace the shape of the Big Dipper, the same constellation that had once guided her north. It was still there, steady and bright, a reminder of the road behind and the promise ahead. But peace never lasted long in those days. One hot summer evening, riders came, men in hoods, torches in hand. They called themselves Defenders of the South, but they were nothing more than ghosts of the old world, refusing to die. They set fire to the church, shouting curses, dragging men into the street. Sarah woke to the noise and grabbed Isaiah. "Hide," she whispered, pushing him beneath the floorboards. She ran outside just as the flames caught the roof. Elias stood before the men, his hands raised. "You can burn the wood," he said, "but not the word." A shot rang out. He fell. Sarah screamed, the sound swallowed by the roar of fire. She dragged Elias's body away, her arms trembling, as the men rode off, laughing into the night. When the smoke cleared, half the settlement was gone. The survivors buried the dead at dawn. The sky that morning was blood red. Isaiah clung to her side, silent, his eyes wide with a kind of fear no child should ever know. After that, something hardened inside Sarah. She had run once, hidden once, obeyed once, but not anymore. She gathered the survivors and spoke with a voice she didn't know she had. "They think we gonna run again," she said. "They think we scared, but we ain't. We gonna rebuild. Right here, on this ground." And they did. Brick by brick, hand by hand, they raised new walls. The new church stood taller than the last, its cross carved from the charred wood of the first one, a symbol of what refused to die. When the first hymn rose from its walls months later, it sounded less like worship and more like defiance. Years passed. The world kept changing. Railroads came, schools grew, laws shifted like sand. But Sarah remained in New Dawn, her hair now streaked with gray, her back bent but unbroken. Isaiah grew tall, strong, with the same quiet fire that had carried her through the river. He became a teacher in the settlement school, reading from books that once would have been forbidden. Every time she saw him standing before his students, his voice calm, his hands steady, her heart filled with something she could barely describe. Pride, yes, but also disbelief, that this child, born in chains, now spoke words of freedom to others. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Isaiah sat beside her on the porch. "Mama," he said softly, "you ever gonna tell me about my real father?" The question hung in the air like smoke. She had known it would come, but still, it pierced her. She looked out at the fields, golden in the dying light. "You got two fathers," she said at last. "One that gave you life and one that gave you purpose. Who's the second one?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Every man and woman that ever helped us on the way. Every soul that prayed we'd make it across that river. That's who you come from." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "Then I reckon I'm rich," he said. She laughed, the kind of laugh that carried years of sorrow and grace. As twilight deepened, she stood and looked toward the horizon. The fields were quiet now. The same soil that had once drunk the blood of slaves now grew food for their children. Freedom wasn't perfect. It never had been. But it was real, earned, fought for, and held by those who refused to let go. She closed her eyes and remembered the sound of the auctioneer's hammer all those years ago. 20 cents. That was what the world had thought she was worth. And yet, standing there now, surrounded by life, by legacy, by the laughter of her son's students drifting through the warm evening air, she knew that the world had been wrong. No one could measure the worth of a soul that refused to bow. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone by the dying fire. The The silver locket still hung around her neck. She opened it and whispered, "We made it." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, soft, steady, like the river calling her name. The stars shimmered above new dawn, the same stars that had once guided her through darkness. Somewhere beyond them, she believed Jonah was smiling. Elias too, all the ones who hadn't made it. Their freedom lived through her now, through Isaiah, through every child that learned to read, every hymn sung in defiance. And as the first light of dawn touched the fields, Sarah whispered to the wind, "For 20 cents they bought me. For faith, I bought the world back." The year was 1885, 19 years since the night the torches came. New dawn had grown. What began as a handful of families and a dream was now a thriving settlement, a school, a church, a marketplace, and homes built from red clay and sweat. Every board and brick carried a story. Every soul that walked its dusty streets bore the memory of struggle and survival. Sarah still rose before dawn. Her hands were not as strong as they used to be, but she worked the same small garden outside, her cabin, humming the same hymns she once whispered to her son in the dark. Her back bent, her hair silvered, but her eyes were still the same, sharp, proud, and alive. And Isaiah, now 21, had become more than a teacher. He was a voice. The newspapers in nearby towns had started calling him the colored preacher of new dawn. Every Sunday, men and women from miles around came to hear him speak. He didn't shout like Elias once did. He spoke softly. But when he spoke, people listened. "Freedom," he would say, "ain't a gift, it's a seed. You got to plant it, water it, protect it, or else it dies in the dust." His words spread beyond the settlement. A group of traveling abolitionists heard of him and invited him to speak in Memphis. It was the first time Isaiah had ever left home. Sarah stood by the road that morning, holding a small cloth bag she had sewn for him. Inside was the old silver locket, the one she had carried through the river. He frowned. "Mama, this yours?" "It was," she said softly, pressing it into his palm. "Now it's ours." Memphis, Tennessee, 1885. The city was bigger than anything Isaiah had ever seen. Horse carriages, factories, and a new kind of tension that pulsed in every street. Freedom had changed the law, but not every heart. Some doors opened wide for him, others slammed shut. He spoke in a small wooden church on Beale Street. The room was crowded, black laborers, white sympathizers, women holding babies, men in worn coats. When he took the stage, the air went still. "My mama used to say," he began, "that the river don't ask where you come from. It just asks if you're brave enough to cross. Well, she crossed it, and I'm standing here 'cause of that." His words painted pictures of fire and freedom, of nights spent hiding, of a woman who had once been bought for 20 cents and had built a life worth 1,000 times more. By the time he finished, people were weeping. Some shouted, "Amen." Others simply sat in silence, knowing they'd just heard a truth deeper than politics. Afterward, an older white journalist approached him. "Young man," he said, "you speak like a man twice your age. Where did you learn?" Isaiah smiled. "From my mother. The world tried to silence her, but she never stopped teaching." The journalist nodded, then scribbled something in his notebook, words that would later appear in the next week's paper. From bondage came brilliance. From 20 cents came a voice that cannot be priced. When Isaiah returned home, the people of New Dawn greeted him like a hero. But Sarah only smiled quietly, proud yet wary. She had lived long enough to know that a loud voice in a quiet land could be dangerous. And she was right. One evening, as the family sat outside their cabin, a rider appeared. Dusty, tired, his horse limping. He handed Isaiah a letter sealed with black wax. The handwriting was jagged, unfamiliar. Isaiah opened it, and his face hardened. "What is it, son?" Sarah asked. He hesitated. "A warning. Says if I keep speaking, they gon' burn the church again." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's hands trembled slightly, but her eyes stayed steady. "Then let 'em burn," she said. "You build it again, like we always done." That summer was one of unrest. In nearby towns, night riders had returned. Freedmen were being threatened, schools vandalized, voices silenced. The promise of equality was being swallowed by fear once more. Isaiah faced pressure from both sides, the people who wanted him to fight louder, and those who begged him to stay quiet for his safety. But silence had never saved anyone. He began holding night meetings deep in the woods, where men and women gathered by lantern light. They spoke of land rights, of education, of unity. Sarah would sometimes stand at the edge of the crowd, listening. She didn't always understand the politics, but she understood the heart of it, the same fire that had once driven her to cross the river. One night, as the crowd dispersed, Isaiah found her waiting by the path. "You proud of me, Mama?" She smiled. "Boy, I've been proud since the day you said your first word." He laughed, but then his face softened. "You ever get tired of fightin', of rememberin'?" She looked at him, the moonlight catching the lines in her face. "Every day. But the day I stop rememberin', I stop being free." In the fall of that year, a storm rolled across Tennessee. Black clouds, heavy rain, thunder shaking the ground. It was the kind of storm that made the world feel like it was being washed clean. Isaiah had just finished a sermon when lightning split the sky. He walked home through the rain, the locket clutched tight in his hand. When he reached the cabin, Sarah was sitting by the fire, humming. "You'll catch your death out there," she said, smiling faintly. He shook the water from his coat. "Ain't nothing out there can touch me long as you still here." But that night, something changed. Sarah's cough, which had come and gone for years, grew deeper. Her breathing slowed. Isaiah stayed by her side, holding her hand as the storm raged on outside. "Don't you go nowhere," he whispered. She smiled through the pain. "Child, I done been everywhere already." When morning came, the rain had stopped, and the world felt still. Too still. Isaiah buried her beneath the magnolia tree, behind their cabin, the same spot where she used to tell him stories when he was small. He carved her name into a wooden cross. Sarah Carter, born in chains, died free. The whole settlement came to mourn. Old men wept openly. Women held their children tighter. No one spoke for a long while. When it was his turn, Isaiah stepped forward. "She taught me," he said softly, "that freedom don't live in papers or laws. It lives here." He touched his chest. "And it don't die with a body. It moves on." Then he opened the silver locket and placed it into the earth beside her. That night, New Dawn was quiet. But in the distance, through the silence, Isaiah thought he heard the faint sound of a river, steady, eternal, whispering the same promise it had once given his mother. Keep moving. Years passed. The South kept changing, piece by piece. Some wounds healed, others didn't. But New Dawn endured. Isaiah grew older, his hair turning gray like hers. He married a woman named Clara, and together they raised 2 children, Grace and Jonah. Every evening before the sun went down, Isaiah would tell them stories of their grandmother. She was small, he'd say, but she carried the strength of a whole people in her hands. And when his children asked how much she was worth, he'd answer, "The world once said 20 cents, but to me, she was the price of freedom itself." The year was 1912, and the river still sang the same song, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, always moving. It had carried slaves toward freedom, whispered through wars, and now flowed past a world that was learning to remember. On its banks stood a woman, tall, graceful, her hair braided like her grandmother's once was. Her name was Grace Carter, the granddaughter of Sarah, the woman once sold for 20 cents. Grace had just returned to New Dawn after years away, her long dress brushing against the wild grass. The old church still stood, weathered but strong, the same wooden bell hanging crooked at the top. The cabins were newer now, the fields greener. Children ran barefoot where once men had picked cotton in chains. But beneath the beauty was memory, the kind that never fades, only settles deeper. Grace had gone north for school. a rare thing for a black woman in her time. Her father, Isaiah, had saved every dollar, preached extra sermons, repaired fences and plows to afford it. Education, he told her, is how we make freedom stay. And she had done it, graduated with honors from the small college in Ohio, where her voice found its rhythm and her mind its wings. Now, returning home, she felt the weight of her grandmother's story pressing on her heart. She had heard it all her life, told in whispers, in songs, in the pauses between her father's words. The woman who crossed the river, the mother who bore a child in chains, the fire that refused to die. And now, the world was changing again. Whispers of a new century carried promises, but also warnings. Isaiah was older now, his hands stiff, his back bent, his hair white as cotton. But when he saw Grace standing at the gate that evening, his smile made him look young again. "Girl," he said softly, "you done made it back home." She ran to him, threw her arms around his shoulders. "I missed you, Papa." He held her close, then stepped back to look at her. Really look at her. "You got your grandma's eyes," he said, "and her walk, like you belong to the wind." Grace smiled, brushing tears from her face. "She's the reason I'm here, Papa. I want to build a school, right here in New Dawn, for the children, for the ones who still think they ain't worth nothing." Isaiah's gaze turned distant toward the horizon. "You think the world ready for that?" Grace's voice was steady. "If it ain't, I'll make it ready." The following spring, construction began on the Sarah Carter School for Colored Children. Grace taught by day and built by night, hammering, painting, writing letters to anyone who would listen. Some white landowners tried to stop her, others mocked her, but she kept going, because in her blood ran the same determination that once walked barefoot through the dark. When the school opened in 1914, nearly 40 children filled its wooden benches. Their laughter echoed across the valley, the sound of freedom reborn. Isaiah stood at the doorway that day, cane in hand, tears glistening. He whispered, "You did it, Mama. You did it." He passed quietly in his sleep a few months later, the silver locket still resting by his bed, the one Sarah had carried through fire, through rivers, through time itself. Grace found it and wore it around her neck every day from then on. When the Great War came, many sons of New Dawn left to fight for a country that still wouldn't sit beside them at a table. Jonah, Grace's brother, was one of them. He wrote her letters from France, his handwriting shaky but hopeful. "They say we fighting for freedom again, sis. Funny thing is, I ain't sure whose freedom it is this time." He never came back. The telegram arrived on a rainy morning in 1918. Grace read it once, then folded it quietly and placed it beside her father's Bible. That night, she walked to the riverbank, the same place her grandmother had crossed so many years before. The moon hung low, the water calm. She opened the locket and let the wind touch her face. "Tell him," she whispered to the river. "Tell him Grandma's waiting." The wind answered with silence, but the water rippled softly, like a hand stroking her sorrow. By the 1920s, New Dawn was no longer a hidden settlement. It had grown into a thriving town, with shops, a newspaper, and the school at its heart. Grace became its leader, its teacher, and its memory keeper. Every year on June 19th, she gathered the children under the magnolia tree, the same one that shaded her grandmother's grave. She told them stories of where they came from. "You see this ground?" she'd say, pressing her palm to the dirt. "This ground was once watered with pain, but look now, flowers grow where tears fell. Don't you ever forget what that means." The children would listen, wide-eyed, some not understanding the full weight of her words. But they would. Remember the tone, the same mix of sorrow and pride that ran through every Carter voice. By 1936, Grace was an old woman herself. The town had changed. Cars replaced wagons, radios replaced sermons, yet the river still sang its same eternal hymn. On her final day, she asked to be taken to the old tree. The townspeople carried her there, her chair facing the water. She wore the silver locket around her neck, its surface worn smooth by time. A small boy, one of her students, asked, "Miss Grace, you ever met your grandma?" She smiled faintly. "No, child, but I hear her every time the wind blows through these fields." Then she looked out across the water, her eyes distant. "My grandmother once said the river don't care where you come from, only if you're brave enough to cross. I think I'm ready to cross now." Her breath slowed. The wind rose softly. And then, peace. Nearly half a century later, in 1964, a group of young civil rights marchers stopped by the town of New Dawn. They were tired, hungry, and unsure of what waited on the road ahead. An elderly woman opened the door of a small museum, once the old Sarah Carter School. Inside they saw the locket, silver, simple, resting beneath glass. A note beside it read, "Belonged to Sarah Carter, bought for 20 cents, mother of Isaiah, grandmother of Grace, price of freedom, eternal." One of the marchers, a young man barely 20, whispered she was a slave. The woman nodded. "Once, but she died a queen." They stood there in silence. Outside, the river kept moving, steady, unbroken, eternal. And as they left, one of them began to hum, an old song, slow and mournful, but filled with light. A song that had once been sung by a young woman in chains, long before freedom had a flag. The same song that crossed rivers, fires, and generations. The river heard it and answered in ripples, because the river remembers. It always remembers. Fade out. From a woman bought for 20 cents. To a nation learning that freedom has no price. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.